All right, let's get started, shall we? I am really excited today to have a couple of guests with me that I think you're going to just get a ton out of hearing from and talking to. Again, welcome to the Gold Star Expert Chat. We do this twice a month, as you know. We bring in people who are in the live entertainment and arts industry, as well as people who are outside of it, but who can help us get a perspective on what we're really all here to talk about, which is what we need to do to get back into the venue, get the industry that we know and love back on track. And today I have two people who I think really can add something to that. And I'd like to introduce them. Our first guest is an attorney. She's the co-chair of Covington & Burling's Global Food, Drug, and Device Practice Group. I mean, I feel like I should just let her do part of this herself because there's so many impressive things. She provides strategic policy and regulatory advice to biotech, pharmaceutical, and medical device clients. 25 years of experience representing clients in the life sciences industry. Before her role at Covington & Burling, she was chief of staff to the FDA commissioner, the deputy chief counsel for drugs and biological products in the FDA office of the chief counsel, and director of policy for FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. You can imagine why we might be interested in talking about those things these days. And a whole bunch more. She's also a big theater fan. Please welcome Denise Esposito. Hi, Denise.
Hey, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Your highlights of your resume are so long that I kind of ran out of breath trying to explain them all, and I didn't even explain them all. So, and
you've given away my age, but I forgive you for that.
Well, I think there's still some math that needs to be done for people to really figure it out. Ends at 40, so it's good. All right, and then also our other guest was named the artistic director of the American Shakespeare Center in June of 2018. Made his directing debut there with Julius Caesar, followed by the world premiere of the Willard Suitcases, which is the poster that I see over your shoulder.
It is.
We'll get to that. Directing credits in New York included a Broadway revival of The Best Man from Gore Vidal, premiere of John Grisham's A Time to Kill, off-Broadway, Never the Sinner, and there's so many more. He was the artistic director of the Chautauqua Theater Company for a number of years and many other places. And this is interesting. You received the first ever undergraduate degree in theater and dramatic arts from Columbia University. Please welcome Ethan McSweeney. Hi, Ethan.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here.
It's, there's so much that we have to talk about. Did I mention that Denise was a theater fan? So that, it's not just medicine and science where, there's so much more. We just have a lot to talk about, I think, here today.
Theater fans are everywhere. I try not to look askance at people with legal degrees because I think some of them can be our best advocates. So.
That's great, Ethan. You're in the minority. Most people don't like lawyers, but we're not that bad.
Nobody likes lawyers until they need one, and then all of a sudden they're your best friend, right? That's exactly right. All right, so as usual, everybody, I'm going to present the new data from the Consumer Sentiment Project that we've been doing for the last several months. Ethan and Denise, do feel free to interrupt me as I'm going through it, because otherwise it's just going to be a very, very long monologue. I want to call everyone's attention to the chat feature that by now, if you've lived in this world for the last several months, you're undoubtedly familiar with. You can go into the chat, do set your to all panelists and attendees, assuming that you want all panelists and attendees to hear what you're going to say. But actually, let's do this, just to get started, just to kind of warm you up a little bit. I'm just going to ask a question. Everybody go to your chat. I'm interested in hearing what Ethan and Denise, you can do this too. I want you to type in a recipe or a food that you've learned to make and that you really like during the COVID crisis. So I want to see your new COVID, go-to food. So everybody, let's see what we got. Type them in. Hit us with them. There's some of you who are not. Okay. Ramen. Okay. Very good. Challah, I love challah. Oatmeal peanut butter chocolate bars, that sounds pretty good. Ravioli, margaritas, Aperol spritz, a lot of booze I'm noticing. Gravlax, excellent. Overnight oats, pork tenderloin, grilled peaches with burrata. You can't go wrong with burrata. Tomato salad, that's Ethan. We'll hear more about that later. Sourdough. In fact, somebody's making sourdough right now, which, I feel like I could smell. I wish. Mac and cheese, chocolate, so many good things. Bell pepper nachos, bibimbap. Tasty. All right. So that's just, I just wanted to make sure everybody knew how to use, make sure that you've got it set to all panelists and attendees if you want everybody to be able to see it. All right. Excellent. And now I've just made myself, it's noon here in Los Angeles. So I'm now made myself super hungry, but I'll get over it. All right. Okay, let's go to the data. Let me know if you can't see that. All right. We have a ongoing project here at Gold Star called the Consumer Sentiment Survey Project, and the goals are to gauge the ongoing sentiment of the event-going public, and in particular, the people who really pay the bills, as Ethan well knows, the frequent and semi-frequent event-goers that really do make up the heart of the economic activity in live entertainment and arts. And then to share this information with all of you, Gold Star event partners, and really anybody who's interested, the whole industry, anybody who's interested, because in the end, it's going to be down to consumer sentiment to determine what happens with our industry. We've done this twice a month since May, large-scale surveys of our members to kind of see what they're thinking about returning to live entertainment events. We do this across 17 metros and beyond, but we actually call out the data in 17 different major metros. And we survey people of all ages, so we have a large enough group to really be able to make statements about how people in different categories are feeling, different places, different ages, etc. The people who are the target of this are pretty frequent event goers. 69% of them in this document say normally they go to live events at least once or twice a month, and some people that we love beyond all words go weekly or more. 21%. Ethan, those are the people we love, right?
Yeah, indeed.
We always get a large sample here so that the results can be pretty reliable, even when we break them down by metro. This time we had 3,621 respondents, which is pretty good. All right. So the first number that we measure every time is the number we call the return readiness score. We give people a little slider bar in the survey that lets them indicate from 0 to 100 if they had live events in their area and it was legal. How willing would they be to go out? Where 0 is like, no way, and 100 is absolutely, let me at them, and 50 is in between. And this survey, our number is 34. Now remember, this is an average. There are a lot of people that are above and below that, but this is the average. And this number did not change from our last survey. So it's been flat for 2 surveys in a row and in the same neighborhood for a little while. So 34 out of 100. What do you think? Denise, Ethan, what do you think? Reaction to that?
Ethan, you want to start?
I mean, that's about a third. So I'm going to go with that's pretty good. I mean, the key question is it legal and are they being produced? And speaking as someone in a region where it is legal and we are producing, I think that our expectation around who in our audience will be ready to return to live events, that's about what we're experiencing. So, I mean, we'll probably talk about this, but our approach has been to provide live events in sort of 3 different settings. So one of them is indoors in our Playhouse, which is a recreation of Shakespeare's indoor stage, the only one in the world. And another is the same 2 shows outside at on the lawn of a nearby inn and conference center. And we're seeing 2 different audiences, one that's ready to come outdoors and one that's ready to come indoors. And they're not entirely the same. So right. There's a little bit of whatever people's personal comfort level is, even though honestly our safety protocols and our mitigations and our universal masking is identical venue to venue. We're not doing anything different. It's just the perception.
You're not relying on the fact that it's outdoor to loosen up the rules.
Definitely not. I mean, definitely not. The only difference is outdoors, our partners are selling concessions, and because people are sitting far enough apart, we let them eat their picnics before the show. But then we're still really intent on requiring everyone outdoors even to sit with their masks on during the performance. And that's as much to protect them as ourselves and our performers as well.
Right. Any thoughts overall on this number?
Yeah, I would say, so from a legal and scientific side, we're always looking to delve into the number and see, why people reacted as they did. And I think one of the things that will be important going forward is understanding, how to move that needle, obviously, to get it higher. But also, what are people thinking about when they say they're ready to go back? How could the data be cut to Ethan's point about indoors versus outdoors, we've got a lot of mixed information from the public health authorities, but one thing that is pretty consistent is that if you look at the data of transmission based on all the contact tracing that the governments are doing, it's a much lower rate outside. So you'd expect to see people who normally go to venues that are outdoors become comfortable sooner than people sitting indoors with a shared HVAC system and, maybe feeling like they're going to be penned in and sitting closer to people. So, it'll be interesting to see as this plays out, whether you get higher numbers in the outdoor settings. And also, I think you'll get to this a little further in the presentation, Jim, but what do they want to see to get more comfortable and to expand that 34%?
Yeah, that's covered a bit. We'll there'll be some more for us to chew on there, but let's look at this first. And this is one way of getting behind the data a little bit. As I mentioned, the 34 is an average, but this is the histogram of results. So the 34 is an average, but it's not typical by any means. The mode answer is much lower than that. So what we've got here, out of 3,600, you got 1,400 people saying basically no way. At least as the way the question is framed, which is broad. And then you have some people, Ethan, to your point, the people up in this upper end, 600-700 of them who are quite willing to do these things, and some people in between. But you still have a large contingent of people who are just not there at all, which is interesting.
I mean, I think it means that as venues, we have to think about what it's going to take to, not just, it's not a question simply of making everyone safe. It's making them feel safe and comfortable enough, and that the risk assessment is low enough that it's okay to take the risk on coming to a live performance. And that's the name of our protocols is ASC Safe Start. It's how we were starting safely, but it turns out that's critical to the audience too. They have to assess the risk through their own experience and whatever their own health conditions are too, right? And because there's no way for any of us to know specifics of individual responses, and then we try and provide as much clarity and safety and clear upfront information as well, so that they can picture themselves coming to a show and imagine what it's like. And we know that the first one is going to be that's going to be the hurdle. I think the second one is going to be a lot easier.
Yeah. This is the trend. You can see that we've sort of bounced around the mid to low 30s and 40s. We haven't had a score outside of the 30s and 40s in the history of this data. I think what's interesting about that is when things begin to change, I think we're going to see it here. Until something is sort of different on this chart, I feel like we're still in the midst of it, at least from a consumer sentiment point of view. We're not at an all-time low, but we're close on this.
You can see in the way it's trending is that in early June, when we all had the optimism that the initial shutdown, the rapid, perhaps overambitious reopening of things was not going to do what it did, that it was starting a trajectory, and then that really gets sat on by the prevailing circumstances. And I think that's caused all of us to have to continue to evaluate and reevaluate in real time. We were already on Plan K by the end of May, and I think now we're probably well into Plan, I don't know,
AA,
R. we may have circled the alphabet and come back around. So.
AA. Yeah, we were definitely, I think if you were here for the mid-June version of this, we were looking at this trend going, well, let's just kind of, maybe we can just keep going up, and maybe, we'll be getting somewhere pretty soon. But then everyone felt it. Like everyone, I felt like I was like dropping a hammer when I presented the data for late June, but everyone knew where it was going, tapping back into the turn that we all experienced there.
If we were in education, we'd probably see the same thing too, where there's been that, okay, we're going to try and get back, and now there's going to be okay, that didn't go so well, kind of.
Did you see the headline of the UNC student paper the other day?
I didn't see the paper. What did it say?
I think we're all friends here. This is literally the page one headline. UNC has a clusterfuck on its hands. This is literally the headline. Okay.
Well,
See that
and that's-
certain journalistic standards are eroded by the pandemic. So that's
Right. All the
Well,
rules.
and it's unfortunate too, because I think to Ethan's point about safe start and taking all the right precautions, we cannot rely on 18 to 22-year-olds to do that. So I think that, that's kind of the worst case scenario when you look at kids who are, particularly the freshmen, finally getting out of their house, feeling like they're invincible.
Yeah.
That doesn't do us any good, and probably is hopefully not consistent with the theater audience.
I think Denise is right. I mean, we put our company of 20 are in our performance group. So that's about 17 actors and 3 or 4 stage managers all voluntarily went into a quarantine and an isolated work bubble that's now self-governed, really. They meet as a group and make sure that they're maintaining their bubble so that it has some flexibility. So, if someone's significant other is visiting or parents or something, like, okay, what are you going to do to keep your mitigation strong and how are we going to protect ourselves as a group? But it's hard enough to do with a group between 20 and 25 and then a couple of other bubbles that we're sort of operating in as a staff and as a production team. I can't quite imagine how you do it with a university student body of somewhere between 20 and 30,000. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, on the last chat a couple of weeks ago, we had a woman from Major League Baseball and another woman from the WNBA and the NBA. And the NBA is doing a wonderful job managing its bubble, but these are highly motivated, extremely highly compensated people, in a very, very well constructed environment where there's nothing missing for them. So
yeah,
I think it's crazy. Let's look at the differences by metro. So those of you who've been tracking this data for a while, remember that we used to have these huge outliers. We used to have these markets, particularly in the sort of Mountain West and Southwest, that were just way out there in the 60s and things like that, numbers that were just far higher than the rest of the group, and that's all gone. So over the last 2 or 3 surveys, we've seen the numbers tighten and go down. Las Vegas, I think at one point I referred to them as crazy. I think their number was 67. Now we're looking at 45, 44.9. Sacramento was much higher, I think nearly 60 at one point. And then now they're more in line with the rest of the group at 44. Phoenix 42, New York at 40. New York has actually slowly gone from the bottom of the pile to closer to the top of the pile for reasons that I think are pretty obvious. San Diego 38, Atlanta 37, Dallas 37. Dallas also at one point was in the 50s or maybe even touching 60. So this has come back. Philly 37, Chicago 36.7. San Houston, I think, is just Houston, but I kind of like San Houston somehow. That's just something about that that's kind of cool.
I thought you'd come up with a new distinction for the greater Houston metropolitan. I mean, maybe it includes Dallas now. Maybe this community has just grown.
I don't think the people of Dallas would appreciate being lumped in.
No, they really wouldn't. No.
Them's fighting words. LAOC, we know that OC can deal with being lumped in with us, so that's fine. 35.7. Everybody outside these metros at 35. And then when you get down, you sort of get a step down to some of these other metros. Miami, Seattle, which at one point was one of the highest. Boston, which has always been on the low side. San Jose, which used to be on the high side. Washington, which has been the lowest number in every survey until this one. But our new pessimist champions are the Bay Area at 25 So, and by the way, sometimes people ask, what's the depth of data on these markets? All of these markets have at least 75 to 100 responses. Some have many more than that. So the data here is pretty solid, pretty small margin of error on this. So yeah, it varies some. It doesn't vary as much as it did a couple of months ago. A couple of months ago, I think there were people in certain markets who just thought that they were not going to experience any aspects of this, and that's turned around, unfortunately. We've basically seen the same phenomenon from the start to the finish. And I don't know, Denise, you might have a comment on this. We certainly have. We asked people, okay, we ask a general question and we say, okay, how about if it's a small venue, meaning under 250? Okay, how about if it's a medium-sized venue? Okay, how about if it's a large venue? And we get a somewhat different response. And a point that Dr. Raccaniello from Columbia made was it really doesn't matter about the size of the venue so much as the spacing.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Jim. I mean, this is probably reactionary, but not rational. So if you think about a small venue where the seats are very close together and the ventilation isn't good, that could be higher risk in reality than a 5,000 plus venue where people are spaced out and the middle seats could be blocked off. And so families could be seated with no stranger next to them with a, you know, state of the art HEPA filtration system. So you don't have to worry about, you know, airborne issues. So I agree completely with Vince that it really depends on the nature of the venue. And also going back to Ethan's point, the care that the venue operators are taking to ensure that people are, you know, whether it's self-certifying that they're not having symptoms when they show up, ensuring that mask requirements are enforced. So there are a lot of characteristics of risk other than the size of the venue and
Yeah.
including our point earlier about indoor versus outdoor. Yeah, I just had something off color to say, Jim, but I've decided to exercise some judgment here.
Was it really funny? I mean, if it was funny,
No, it's
okay.
It's not even funny.
Oh. Well,
I mean, I think it's funny, but just in my head.
okay. We'll do that after we get off the broadcast.
Okay.
Yeah, it is a perception thing, right, Ethan?
Well, you know, it's interesting because to follow with what Denise said, ASC's Blackfriars Playhouse seats a total of about 307 if we really squeezed everybody in. Mm-hmm. We are, because of social distancing, we have voluntarily restricted our seating capacity. I mean, we've spaced everybody out to 105. So that's about 1/3 of the seats. So we are probably, according to this measurement, technically a medium-sized venue functioning with a small-sized audience. So it might be interesting even in future polls to think about this as not just the size of the venue, but the size of the audience within the venue and see if there's a way to get to that number. I mean, of course, the challenge then becomes how do you sustain your business on a 100% sellout for us is now 1/3 of what we might once have been able to get to. So
yeah, I do think the question sort of implies that if the venue is 250 to 5,000, you're going to be sitting with 250 to 5,000. So maybe we rework the question a little bit, but I do think there's the perception that somehow if it's just fewer people, maybe it's safer. And I think it's a little bit of an artifact of at the beginning of all of this, that was the way people were talking about it more. So then I think this is less a matter of just perception and more real, which is the age group differences, which are substantial. 35 and under, their numbers are low, but they're not nearly as low. And as you can see, their number came down by 2 from the last survey to this one. The middle age group, the 35 to 65s, and if you've been following this, you've seen it. These numbers have been very close all the way through, just a slight difference between the middle age group and the younger group, and then we have this sort of jump down to the older group whose number is 25 in this survey and hasn't changed. This, by contrast to the size thing, is pretty logical. There's good reason for people to feel this way, probably, based on what we know.
Well, I would just add, Jim, it doesn't surprise me that the 35 and under obviously has been pretty low. It's interesting to me that it has gone down, probably because if you look at the trajectory of the pandemic, when people were first getting sick, it really looked like it was the elderly and people who had underlying health conditions. And now, as we're seeing people at universities get sick, and unfortunately higher death rates in the younger population that we had seen before, and just looking at it from a data and news consumption perspective, I wonder if we'll continue to see that number go down as more young people get ill.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think there's maybe this idea that if you have a very young audience for your, let's say it's a festival or something, that they're totally ready to go back. And our data doesn't say that. Our data says that there's reticence even there, even though it's higher. Um, One of the things that I look at every time is cross-tabbing the 65 plus with the large venue. And the number there is like 9. And it's just like, the willingness of the 65 and up crowd to go to a large venue is very low. So, okay, this is one that's of interest actually, Ethan. I think we'll have more to say on this. Is if we emphasize, we say, looking back on your answer that you gave a 34 to, how would that change if there was strict cleaning routines and social distancing and sort of that whole thing of the venue taking care? And you can see the impact here. We go from 34 to 43. So there is a bump. There's definitely an impact if we emphasize that those things are going to happen.
Yeah, I wonder too if how much of that is about articulating the specifics of what you're doing, and as Denise has pointed out, the science has been evolving alongside the experience of being in this. So where once we were super focused on surfaces, I think now we're much more focused on mass and airborne transmission as the primary drivers. Not that you don't do all the surfaces, but that may not have been the biggest thing. I'm always reminded the AIDS epidemic started while I was in high school. There you can now know my age, but in junior high. But I mean, I really often think back to how much misinformation there was in the first half a dozen years surrounding that, and how you could get it and what transmission meant, and when everyone was sure that like toilet seats was going to be the way. You know what I mean? It's like we're getting more familiar with the reality of what coronavirus and COVID-19 is in terms of the disease and the symptoms and all of that. And I think it's helping us get a little more sophisticated so that it's not just we're going to clean everything. It's specifically what are we cleaning, specifically why, specifically how often. We're also just not using our facility as frequently. So if we're, especially while we're doing the shows outside, but if we let 24 hours go by between the end of one use and pretty much the beginning of the next, that alone probably is a substantial mitigation. It's not one I'm going out like, don't worry, we haven't been here for a day, but we're not packing people back in like an airline, the way, you land the plane and see if you can get the people boarding while the guys are still cleaning up at the far end. So,
right. Yeah. Okay. This is a question you guys mentioned, and we have been asking it for a while, which is, okay, how about not indoor venues, but venues that are outdoors, like gardens and zoos, or that don't require people to be seated near each other, like museums, aquariums, and things like that. And this one, the number's substantially higher. So this one, it's 55. That probably helps with your outdoor series, Ethan and Denise. I'm suspecting this doesn't surprise you at all.
No, it doesn't. It's consistent with the data. There are a couple of studies that came out in the last 3 or 4 weeks, really confirming that even with higher numbers and even frankly being closer to each other, the risk of transmission is just much lower outdoors because there's just less of a chance that the droplets are going to hang around. I mean, obviously, if you're very close to someone, that doesn't apply.
Right.
But we have seen, indoors, there have been some HVAC-driven cases. So there's some evidence that the virus can hang in the air a little bit too long and travel in HVAC, but outside it's just less of a risk. Going back to the sophisticated measures, you can create, this won't resonate with most people unless there's education around it, but you can replicate an outdoor venue with a really sophisticated air handling system. So negative pressure environments where air is being sucked straight up have had lower cases than places where air is moving around. So if you think about outdoors where there's room for droplets to disperse, a good HVAC system can almost recreate that indoors. So I think this aligns with the data, but people should also be thinking about you can make a safe environment through good HVAC indoors and maybe move that needle even for indoor venues.
Let's come back to that, and when we get through the rest of the deck, because I think people are going to be interested in talking about that. This was a question we started asking at the request of somebody in the group, which was, hey, how willing would you be to wear a mask during an event, including before and after the show? And once again, the number is very high at 86. Down one, I think that's sort of random, but and this is the histogram on that. Very, very high degree of subscription to the 91 to 100. And on down, you've got this group of people down here that doesn't necessarily say they'd come to the venue and refuse to wear a mask, but it might mean that even with that, they wouldn't do it or they just wouldn't go. And this expresses itself, Ethan, as you know, because nobody in the house staff wants to get into an argument with a patron about this.
Yeah, I mean, what I've been saying since the beginning is we also require our audiences to wear shirts and shoes, and usually we get a pretty good buy-in on that. So I think it's obviously, a particular tragedy in this country that this has become a political issue, and one where there's a certain group that wants to express themselves by not wearing a mask. But since we've required people to have tickets, it doesn't seem to me to be impossible to require them to have masks. And it is the law of my state. So, they would be breaking the law, and so would we. So we've opted to also message from the stage. We do a pre-show 15 minutes of music before every performance. And in between the songs, we message the mask stuff in ways that are not just, no one really responds all that well to being like just given an instruction or an order, right? So we have to find ways to get everyone to socialize the buy-in for that, much the same actually as you might, at the pre-flight, trying to make sure everyone puts their own mask on first before turning to their neighbor. So I think there's a way to get there with this. We have had pretty good response rates we have, even outside where there's probably more potential for audiences to feel like, why would you need to do that? We try and explain why it's important and why we're going to layer all these mitigations together for the best possible result. So, I'm optimistic that, again, it gradually, I think the political aspect of this is being drowned out by the science. So
yeah, I hope so. All right. And just to make ourselves feel better, mostly to make ourselves feel better, we asked the question, how much are you looking forward to being able to go to live events, sports, entertainment, and arts again in the future? And we always get a pretty nice high number, 87, same as last time. So a lot of people who really can't wait to get back into the venue. So that's encouraging. That's encouraging for all of us. All right. I assume that I'm not sharing anymore. It's just us now, just us on camera. Okay, so let's see. I want to invite anybody who has a question or wants to chat with us to put it in Q&A or put it in chat. Up to you, doesn't matter. Meantime, Denise, why don't you talk a little bit about the work you do, because we haven't really gotten to that yet. So yeah, let's. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that people are going to want to hear about.
Sure, Jim. So my job, I'm an FDA regulatory lawyer, and so I work with drug companies and diagnostic companies who are developing, doing a lot of things, but in the pandemic, the vast majority of my work has been working with companies who are developing therapeutics, vaccines, and diagnostics. So there aren't very many good therapeutics right now, as we're seeing, watching the news. There's still a very relatively high mortality rate because there are a few therapies that FDA has approved under an emergency basis, but nothing that's really good. The antivirals are not proving to be super effective because by the time people have symptoms, their viral loads are pretty high. So the focus is really now shifting to what can we do to stop the spread and what can we do to detect it early. And so the vaccines and the diagnostics have been top of mind, as well as, and I think Ethan and others will be interested in this too, there's been a lot of focus on whether there could be various uses of thermal imaging technology that is used right now, principally in industrial settings and defense settings. But large venues, could they have some sort of thermal imaging unit as you walk in the door? So, we're all used to going in and having our purses searched, and sometimes in large venues walking through, particularly at sports events and large concerts, you're walking through an X-ray machine. And there could be a thermal imaging camera up there that's going to flag people who are above 98.6 by some fair margin. So that's, the FDA is looking at all of those kinds of things. So I'm working with companies that are developing those various types of technologies.
And so therapeutically, we're not getting an upper hand at this point, I suppose. The rate of mortality per case is dropping, presumably just because the average age is dropping.
Yeah, I think we don't know yet. We probably won't know the real mortality rate until all of this is behind us and there's a good look back on the data and the science. I think that a lot of hospitals have really figured out how to manage individual patient care. So there are some drugs that work, and we've learned obviously that ventilators early on are important. And so to the extent we're sure that the mortality rate is of infected people is going down, I think it's just day-to-day patient care, not because there's a blockbuster drug. There are a few drugs that have gotten an emergency use authorization from FDA. One's an antiviral. There's a lot of work going on. FDA just put a hold this morning on some work around whether convalescent plasma from an infected person could help the next person to get sick, and that's not that date. Those data aren't looking great. So yeah, I think it's individual patient care driven, and we're not going to see a blockbuster drug anytime soon. I think that the focus is really on, can we prevent people from getting it, as opposed to can we cure it quickly when we know somebody has it.
Right. So it leaves us in the industry sort of responding to whatever comes along. And Ethan, you've been, I think, particularly active in finding ways to deal with it. You've taken a few different approaches to this. You mentioned before, you've got the indoor venue where there's the spacing, you've got these outdoor venues. There's a couple of other things that maybe worth talking about too, such as labor, where it's a slightly touchy subject, I realize, but I think a lot of people are asking this question of like, how do we keep people safe, but how do we also maintain and honor our agreements and relationships with the labor side of it? Anything you can share on that might be helpful for people?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, ASC was really very fortunate in a couple of different ways. One, we're a relatively small venue, and then two, we practice this historically based approach to the plays of Shakespeare. So we don't rely on a very technologically sophisticated. We basically don't use anything that really Shakespeare wouldn't have had access to. Everything's acoustic. The focus is on the actor and on the spoken word. That meant that towards the end of May, or in May, when we were looking at trying to ramp up into production, it was not inconceivable for ASC to decide to go into production and 2 weeks later be in rehearsal. And now in a normal theater setting, the lead-in time for building your scenery, building your costumes, installing your scenery and costumes and teching them would have probably been more like 3 to 4 months instead of 2 to 3 weeks. So that was something that gave us an advantage. And we're rural. So we are not in any of those. I mean, our closest metropolitan center from your list is Washington, D.C., and that's about 125 or 30 miles away. Mm-hmm. So while we are a destination theater and we draw very much on an audience who travels, and we're definitely not seeing a lot of that going on, we're also in a rural environment in the middle of a rather progressive state that responded early because it had to deal with, significant outbreaks, mid-Atlantic, Northeast style through Northern Virginia, and then in fact a sort of secondary series of outbreaks in the Virginia Beach, Hampton Roads, coastal regions of the state. So our state took a very strong early response, and our community didn't have as nearly as much of an outbreak. We also worked because we're a small community, we were able to partner with our leading healthcare provider, Augusta Health, very directly and work with their epidemiologists and evaluate our facility and our region so that we could come up with a plan that was really tailored to us.
Yeah, I was going to say, you created a plan, the Safe Start plan, with advice from Stanton City officials, community leaders, infectious disease specialist from the hospital. Actually, we should share that with people. If
Yeah, we can send you the link on the chat if you want. I mean, we can definitely, our plan is available, and it's iterative. You know, I mean, we created the plan beginning in May. We have not stopped creating the plan. I mean, we continue to evolve it as we learn more, and as we come across, you know, oh, whoops, there's something that we need to be more careful about. You know, we now are actually encountering a situation where we have a staff member who's returning to her home in a different state. So that performance group is going to need to have someone new come into it. So we're putting them into a quarantine and evaluating from there. So
yeah, you've created a bit of a bubble in a number of settings, and we were talking, I think, before we started about the sports bubbles and then last time we were on, people were saying, yeah, but you know, the sports leagues have a lot of money, so they can create these bubbles. But you guys have also created bubbles that have been fairly effective.
Yeah, and we do not have the same amount of money as the NBA. I just want to, I know, just to be clear.
You might not have the same amount of money as like one of the NBA.
We don't have the same amount of money as one of the NBA, like the assistant to the assistant coach right now. So I think, which should be inspiring to say it can be done. I mean, it's not easy, and it requires an enormous commitment, and you have to recognize that the individual has to be responsible for the collective well-being, and one person departing from that and your bubble isn't going to succeed.
Right.
What I think was in our favor is, again, we are rural. We have a company. We produce a company of actors in repertory, so we were able to have a small group. Because we don't have a lot of technology and scenery, that group is very tight. So we don't have a huge backstage crew. I mean, I've done shows where my backstage crew was 5 times bigger than my onstage crew. So that's not the case here. Those are all factors that work in our favor. They're factors that everyone else who's going to be in the business of producing are going to want to think about how they can encounter, because keeping your groups, I mean, we also were looking at some of the stuff that's being done in the film industry where it's about, right, this is red team, blue team, green team. We're going to keep, you know, your set is closed except for the people who have to be there. But we can still bring in the blue team set dressers as long as we clear the set before, you know.
This is what the NBA is referred to as tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 personnel. Very strict rules on who can interact with who within that. Which is like a similar kind of.
And I mean, we've done that insofar as our offices, our office staff is separate from our performance staff. Our offices are also not in the same building as our theater, so that's not too hard to maintain. We don't ever encounter them directly. I haven't rehearsed without a mask on since March. I mean, you know, I wear a mask so often. I was in the theater by myself the other day and realized I was wearing a mask the whole time because it's so ingrained in me now that that's what you do. You know, I also think that in some of those sports cases, they were in a hurry. And so they couldn't wait the full 14 days. And, you know, even with testing, there's probably nothing quite as resounding as a true 14-day quarantine. So that's, you know, I think that in some of the sports cases where it hasn't worked out as well, it's because they were moving groups of people into close proximity without the mitigations in place and not necessarily having the full amount of time to wait. And that's tough because that's, you know, you got to think about that. What we did was we went into rehearsal for 2 weeks virtually, which wasn't an unfeasible thing for us to do, the kind of text table work stuff you do, especially with a classic play, for a couple of weeks before we got into in-person.
Interesting. It's very good. I want to invite everybody again. You guys are unusually quiet today. Please do ask questions. And Denise, real quick, can you tell us more about the HVAC systems that can be used to simulate the air volume and the safety of the outdoor again? I think that's probably something that maybe could be funded. I mean, I feel like there could be grants written to fund such things in this day and age. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And we do have a couple of questions.
Sure. And, you know, these generally aren't things that are FDA regulated. They are regulated by other government entities. So with that caveat, so, you know, in the world of HVAC systems, right, in air handling systems, there are various ways to, you know, we often think about, well, there's heating and cooling and ventilation. It's good to have ventilation, but from a scientific perspective, there are systems that are negative pressure, which means it is pulling pressure out of the space instead of blowing pressure into the space. And there's some evidence now based on some testing and data that were collected from different types of venues with different types of HVAC systems, that if you have a negative pressure system where you're pulling air out, particularly if you're pulling air up, I suppose you could say the same thing about pulling air down, but that's less common. But there are some large venues that have air handlers that pull air up. And so if I'm sitting very close to Jim, we shouldn't be sitting within 6 feet, but regardless, right? but if we were, then the respiratory droplets are going to stay in the air for a shorter period of time if they get pulled up. If the HVAC system is blowing toward me, it's just going to help my respiratory droplets get to Jim, which we don't want. We want it pulled the other way. So I think there's going to be investment, again, not FDA regulated, but this will be, OSHA has a lot of experience in this, and there'll be a lot of focus on, should people be investing in systems that make indoor transmission less likely for this and other pathogens.
Yeah. I mean, it's the kind of thing that if you did it, it would mitigate, in a normal year, it would mitigate the flu, presumably. It would mitigate, anything communicable.
Right, anything that's communicated mostly through the droplets. I mean, to Ethan's point about the science, there are some virus and bacteria that live for long periods of time on surfaces. We're learning that thankfully SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus itself, is not. But it can't, it's got to help. Unfortunately, they're big infrastructure investments, so this is not an easy fix. You can't just like pop a fan on the ceiling and make it work. But to your point about whether the government should be investing and whether there should be grants in this area, I would imagine that that's already happening.
I mean, Ethan, it feels like something that foundations might fund under certain circumstances with grants.
Yeah, I think people are ready to fund it. I think what we need to get is information about what it is we need to do. You know what I mean? And it is actually difficult to get a metric. And I'd even have that question, Denise, if you know of what, like, how do you measure is there a cubic airflow? Because as we've seen with all of this, it has so much to do with tailoring it to the individual company, the individual venue, the individual community. And I think that's been one of the interesting challenges, is that there aren't one size fits all solutions. And every time we try and come up with one, you can always find some size where that doesn't fit, or some, you know what I mean? So it to me, again, right now, in terms of actively trying to produce in this environment, it's about having as many different layers as you can, so that you've got so many different sieves to try and filter everything.
Right, and we're also learning about masks, right? So there was that study that Duke did that's been criticized, but who knows, that where they tried 14 different masks, and they did some imaging to see which mask was most protective, and their conclusions broadly were, one layer is not that helpful. My position on that is really depends on the material, but multiple layers are better. They came to the conclusion that the gaiters are not as good as the face masks. But again, we don't know how scientific the evaluation was with the materials. But I think you're right, Ethan, that, masks combined with good ventilation, combined with social distancing and, surface cleaning as well. I mean, I think we just need to look at as many ways to get the risk funneled smaller and smaller until we know more about it. And my experience with I don't have a ton of experience on these HVAC systems, but the pharmaceutical industry uses them a lot, because in manufacturing suites, you have to have negative pressure to avoid contamination in drug manufacturing. And so they're very sophisticated and very expensive. So it's not something you can just pop in. And I would imagine you need an expert engineer to come in and figure it out on a space by space basis.
I wonder if it's worth looking back at any of the smoking, indoor smoking situations from a decade or more ago, because it does remind me of sort of creating positive and negative pressure zones in a restaurant to try and, back when you could still have smoking areas, or, that sort of thing too. If there's some of that would be a way to look at it. Because I think we are going to have to figure out ways to look at it that there's probably a low likelihood that little American Shakespeare Center in rural Stanton, Virginia, is going to be capable of affording, a Pfizer level negative air pressure for their drug development suite. So it's like, if we want it to get implementable, we have to find not just a funding stream, but also something that is a manageable upgrade that we could do. Like, okay, here are things you could do, and then we could add to that list of, okay, we're doing all these things. Therefore, the risk, as you put it, the risk funnel is lower. People's threshold to get to that percentage that Jim has brought up, we see that start to tick up, because it's like, okay, I feel like there's a reasonable, probability that I could enjoy this experience and not get sick.
I want to mention a couple things that have come through. Susan Boyd says she's with the Little Theater of Alexandria, I presume Virginia, could maybe not. And they're developing a similar reopening plan. Be interesting to compare. So Ethan, you could certainly connect.
Yeah, absolutely.
They did a staged reading last week with a small audience, and they're going to find out how it worked out. She says, yes, it is Virginia. So there you go. You guys are almost neighbors. Not really, but almost.
I live in Alexandria, so.
Oh, very good. All right, so you could have been at that staged reading, Denise.
That's great. It's great to hear that, actually, because I think that more people finding safe ways to try and begin again is going to be critical. And, it will be the small organizations that are going to lead the big ones, because it's actually way easier for Little Theater and for American Shakespeare Center than it is for Lincoln Center and Kennedy Center and, Guthrie Theater and even Arena Stage and these really big ones, because they are required. They aren't built to have fewer than a certain percentage of their audience in, and the math and the metrics for it. I mean, this comes up in the Broadway conversation all the time, but there are no Broadway shows that are built to not turn a profit. So like, you can't run Broadway on 40% of your audience attending. If you have 40% of your audience attending, the stop clause is thrown in you and you're closed. I mean, so, that's just, it will be the not-for-profits and it will be the smaller theaters that are going to help model the behaviors.
Let's talk, just before we go, I think we won't go more than a minute or two long, because I want to respect everybody's time, but I think we have to talk about vaccines. Elliot was asking a question about this and directed it toward you, Denise. When we have a vaccine, is there a threshold in terms of rates? And I guess this is an opinion question, to make people feel safe in that. Is it some number, what would be the confidence inspiring sort of penetration there? And I know that you know a lot about the process for getting vaccines trialed and cleared. Maybe you could sort of take that as a two-part question and give us a little bit of information about how that's going in general.
Yeah. I wish I had better news on that front than I do. So FDA just put out some guidance on what they're expecting to see as a minimum efficacy rate. So normally we would expect to see, if you look at the childhood vaccines, so measles, formerly polio, mumps, et cetera, their efficacy rates are very high, and they've gotten to the point where what we call durable immunity, the immunity lasts. So far, FDA has not seen, they've only seen preliminary data on the vaccines that are in development. And they think that the threshold, at least at the outset of the first approval, will be 50%. In other words, if a company can get to 50%, FDA is going to see that as good enough. Obviously, if somebody can hit it out of the park and get to 90%, the 50% vaccines will fall away. But right now, I think the public health experts are thinking that they're not going to really be able to guarantee more than a 50% efficacy rate, and they're not confident it's going to last. So that they're very much still in development. So again, there could be a blockbuster vaccine there are about 5 that are in the lead right now in development. So we could see better numbers than that. And I think, that everyone always wants to know, when are we going to have a vaccine? I'll go back to the process question, Jim, in a minute, but, I don't think we'll have, I always say, I don't think we'll have a vaccine before the election. So I think that, maybe the end of the year or early next year, we'll have something that FDA has authorized for emergency use. But to be candid, I think that supply is going to be limited, and possibly even FDA authorization is going to be limited to first responders, so doctors and, police officers, people who have to be out in the community saving lives. So I think in terms of a general population vaccine, we can't rely on that to reopen theaters and feel comfortable. We have to get ourselves comfortable in some other way. To touch on the process point, Jim, I think one thing FDA is doing is and CDC and NIH as well, all of the public health organizations are insisting on good data. And so typically for a vaccine, one of the records that people put out there is 3 to 5 years being fast for a vaccine development. It's usually that by the time we hear about a vaccine in development, it's been under development for 10 years. So it's really 15 years from, identification of a pathogen to a vaccine. A bunch of new technologies are out now. So you hear about these messenger RNA vaccines, which is the Moderna vaccine. There are a couple of others out there where the technology permits the process to go much faster. The vaccine doesn't have to be grown up in a biological manner. There are other ways to do this. And so they've said publicly, some of these companies have said that they think that they can cut their research and testing time down so that they can have preliminary data by this fall and possibly approval within 18 months of the first trial, which started in May. So really we're looking at 2021 to 2022 before these companies are even going to have a full data set. I think there'll be some availability of the vaccine on an emergency basis before that, but I think it's a pretty long haul. FDA requires, for safety reasons, you have to go through a safety study, a small safety study, and usually with these vaccines, they're doing hundreds of people, but 50 to 100 people, and then they're in phases, phase 1 trial, phase 2 trial in hundreds, and then a phase 3 trial in thousands, to make sure that the vaccine's not causing more harm than good, because these are biological products you're injecting into humans. So all that testing has to be done to ensure that it's both safe and effective.
So the process, there's still a long road ahead, and it could be longer or shorter, but it's not a near-term fix by any means.
Right.
I mean, that's really sobering report there, Janice. And I mean, it makes me think that, we all want it to be like a montage in a Hollywood movie where we can just speed through this part. And hard work is going to take a lot of time. And it just seems to me all the more reason why it is critical to figure out what the layers and the mitigations are to permit something to get started again, because the idea that we could all sit on the sidelines until there's some kind of 100% vaccine out there is unrealistic at this point.
Yeah. The mindset of waiting for a silver bullet is probably going to be a very destructive mindset.
I agree.
Right. I think we all need to realize that that the risk mitigation features are going to be much more important than sitting around waiting for a vaccine. Even when we get a vaccine, there's not going to be 100% uptake. There are going to be people who don't get it. And so the other piece of this too is diagnostics. Right now they're expensive and time consuming, but FDA is starting to approve some more home tests, and suppliers are trying to ramp up production. And we could get to a point where there's a less expensive diagnostic test that people can do at home, which I think will really open up venues. If you can rely on, as Ethan said, individuals taking responsibility for the greater good, you can test, know you're fine, get online.
Yeah, this is Vince's thing and I think this was two chats ago. Vince's thing is, the $1 15-minute lickable test that everybody just has a stack of them, and everybody tests every day, and you get a handle on the thing pretty fast, and then you can control it. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. A combination of all those things works out. But by the way, I wanted to say, the other thing that we're gonna talk about more in this format is online events. As an important thing, because these are really emerging. We'll have a lot more to say about them. And we at Gold Star have some things that we're going to be sharing with you on that front pretty soon. But
I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out that ASC is we're live streaming and starting this week. So we are getting into that new territory as well. You have to have a production to have a live stream. So, you got to actually be producing, but we're going to try and offer that as another way, recognizing that there's indoors, outdoors, and then there's at home.
That's right.
Online is another way that people can be a part of stuff. So
that's absolutely right. And I think that, that whole thing of like, how do you produce, I think this is a very important question for people to think about doing it. I would just add this one perspective, which is that when everybody, and I'm doing air quotes if you can't see me, when everybody went home from work back in March, actually 90 million out of 150 million American workers continued to physically go to work every single day. Which, when you think about that, it sort of changes the maybe the dynamic in a way to do what Ethan and others have done, which is to figure out if we can keep people safe, in the 90 million, safe in their work to the degree that people did take that responsibility seriously. Well, that can be done across a lot of different areas, and we definitely, I don't know. I mean, sitting, as you say, sitting on the sidelines for a couple of years does not seem like a path. That's just not, it's just not viable, really. So, boy, I tell you, it's a complicated set of issues that, if a year ago we'd been flashed forward into this moment in this conversation, I think we would all said, what in the hell are we talking about?
Would have been like, let's get out of this movie. Let's do the montage. Fast forward.
But I do say, and online events are a positive outcome that I think will endure beyond this, that wouldn't have been possible but for this. And there's other things too, probably. But we're going to talk more about that in upcoming chats. I hope you guys join us for those, as just, you can just pelt us with questions and tomatoes from the sideline. We'll have you back later. But I just want to thank Denise Esposito and Ethan for joining me today. This was great. I thought it was a great conversation.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Jim. Thanks, Jim. This is great that you guys are doing this. And Ethan, I personally, as a theater goer, would come back to American Shakespeare Center. Given everything you're doing, it's good to hear that you're taking all of these risk mitigation measures. I think it's going to be, we're in it for the long haul, and this is great to hear that we'll have some theater options.
Thanks, Denise. That's a great vote of confidence. We'll take it. Also, really, really, really like hearing what you had to say about some of the stuff with FDA. It's just so hard to get clear information, and that's sort of been one of the key things for all of us. So, Jim, thank you for providing that forum for people to get information direct from a source like Denise. It's really, really vital.
I'm just so delighted to have people like you guys to join me on this. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today. We have a big audience. They stayed with us the whole time, even though we're 5 minutes over. So thanks to everybody for sticking around. Go to the Show Up group on Facebook. We'll share the recording. We'll share all the resources that came out there. And if there's anything you need, let us know there, and we'll be in touch. We'll see you in a couple of weeks with new data and new guests, and we'll talk to you later.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Crachez-vous dessus, il est encore temps.